Welcome back to Grade 7 History, Unit Number 2, Conflicts and Challenges in Canada, 1800 to 1850. This is Lesson Number 20, How were communities affected by immigration? Before we begin today's lesson, let's consider the following. Take a closer look at the picture on the previous slide. And once I'm finished reading this slide, I'll switch back to the previous slide. But here's what I want you to keep in mind. What are the artist's views of immigrants who came to settle in the Canadas in the early 1800s? Does the immigrant in the picture, he's the one wearing the green jacket and getting his nose pinched, appear prepared for the challenge of living in Canada in the early 1800s? So let's go back, and you'll see this same picture in your textbook. And so the question I left on the next slide was, does this immigrant appear prepared for the challenges of life in Canada? That's one thing I want you to write down a response to as you put this video on pause. Just before you hit pause though, take some time to take a look at how this upper or lower Canadian person is being portrayed. Do you think that this is an accurate or even a fair representation of what people who lived in upper and lower Canada looked like in the 1800s? So put the video on pause so that you can write down your thoughts on this picture now. All right, and let's proceed. A large wave of immigrants came to the Canadas after 1815 in search of a better life. Between 1815 and 1840, the population of Upper Canada rose from 100,000 to over 400,000. Lower Canada had a similar population increase. Most immigrants came from England, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. And this painting shows the ships carrying immigrants into Montreal. Now here's a question for you to consider. How do you think the scene would be different after the immigrants came off the ships? Because we don't see, at least we don't see clearly, anybody coming off of the ships. So what do you think the people looked like after such a long journey on a cramped ship where disease no doubt spread quite easily? Poverty and overcrowding in Britain were the main reasons why so many people were leaving for the Canadas. The Industrial Revolution had resulted in a rapid growth of technology and changes in the way goods were manufactured. Machines were doing tasks that were once done by hand. Living conditions got worse as more and more people moved to cities and towns in search of work. The British government saw the Canadas as a way to rid Britain of its problems. So, a couple of illustrations depicting the Industrial Revolution. One, you can see a lot of people crammed into a factory where they're doing fairly heavy manual labor. And then we've got this interesting picture here with women and children, along with a rather deathly looking figure right here. And my question for you is, what do you think this illustration in black and white is telling you about the effects of the Industrial Revolution? Now I'll put the video on pause to take a closer look at this black and white illustration and write down your thoughts on what you see in this illustration. All right, let's move on. Crossing the Atlantic Ocean by ship was the only way to get from Britain to Canada. Most people spent weeks crossing the Atlantic on timber ships, which were designed for carrying lumber, not people. This form of travel was, of course, not safe. Well, in the 1820s, the British government gave some financial aid to help immigrants secure transportation. Most immigrants paid for their own boat fare. The fee for first class travel was high, so most immigrants had to pack themselves into lower decks and endure harsh conditions. Disease spread rapidly on the ships, and 1 in every 28 passengers died before the 4 to 8 week long journey ended. This massive influx of newcomers had many consequences for Canadian communities. This was seen in Montreal as the increase in British immigrants resulted in less than half of Montreal's population being French. Quebec City was the most popular landing destination, although most immigrants would board a second boat and head out for other Canadian locations. The Rideau Canal was a favorite route for people traveling to Upper Canada. Cholera is a contagious and often fatal disease that results in fever, diarrhea, and dehydration. In 1832, cholera was one of the diseases that were carried to the Canadas on the immigrant ships. In its first year, the disease killed 7,500 lives in Quebec City and Montreal alone. There was great panic, as no one knew what caused the sickness and how to stop it. It was not until the 1850s that people learned that cholera is spread by contaminated food and water. Health boards were established to care for the disease and to inspect the immigrant ships. And here's one of a number of notices which were put out by public health boards at the time. This particular posting here telling people to be temperate in eating and drinking. So, in other words, to eat and drink in moderation. It was telling people stay away from cold water, to sleep and to clothe warm, uh, and to not sleep or sit in a draft of air. Avoid getting wet. So my question here is, why do you think public health notices like this one were unsuccessful in stopping cholera? We'll chat a bit about this in tomorrow's class. The increase in the population meant that more people were clearing land. However, as previous groups, Loyalists, War of 1812 veterans, found, rural life in the backwoods meant long days of hard labor. There was little time for socializing, and families were often separated by kilometers of forest. Many immigrants wrote letters to their family and friends back in Europe. Some immigrants, like Susanna Moody, Catherine Parr Traill, and Anne Langton, kept journals about their experiences. They later became authors, and their books about life in the backwoods became, sorry folks, and their books about life in the backwoods became very popular in the Canadas and in Europe. Their writings help historians and students of history today understand the challenges faced by immigrants in the early 1800s. The population boom did have positive economic effects on the Canadas. The timber and wheat industries were very successful. The Industrial Revolution reached the Canadas, and Canada's first bank, the Bank of Montreal, was formed in 1817 in response to the growing economy. The Industrial Revolution also resulted in the construction of Canada's first public railway in 1836. The Champlain and St. Lawrence Railroad was built in Lower Canada, and it connected the St. Lawrence River Valley with Lake Champlain. And clearly, this was a very small railway indeed. We can actually see the conductor sitting up front in this locomotive, and he's completely exposed to the elements. People began moving to the cities to find jobs. Workers were in high demand, especially in Upper Canada. Because of this demand, some poor immigrants were welcomed as a source of cheap labor. Laborers, such as those who worked on the Rideau Canal, were often the poorest immigrants from Ireland and Scotland. Established farmers were having difficulty hiring workers for their farms, as so many immigrants wanted to work in cities or start their own farms. These established farmers would write to emigration societies in England asking for help finding employees. And this is one of Anne Langton's sketches. What details in this illustration tell you what life was like for settlers in the 1830s? While you put the video on pause for a few moments so you can jot down your ideas on what this illustration shows us about a settler's life in the 1830s. Okay, and let's continue. By 1815, the First Nations were outnumbered 10 to 1. Much of their land had been taken for the new immigrant settlers, and they found their relationship with the land was changed as a result of the changes brought by settlement, and some tribes found themselves near collapse. The Mississauga Nation went so far as to appeal to the Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada for help. The Mississauga chief, Peter Jones, converted to Christianity and tried helping his people adjust to the presence of Europeans. He made the Ojibwe language a written language, and he translated the Bible into various First Nations languages. Now, while his intentions were well-meaning, these changes still affected the Mississauga Nation's traditional lifestyle greatly. And here's a painting of Mississauga Chief Peter Jones. And take a close look at this picture and think about it. What is it that's unusual about Jones's appearance in this portrait? And of course, we'll talk about this in tomorrow's class. But right now, we're at the wrap-up portion of today's video. So let's finish today's lesson by considering the following, and then we'll talk about it in class next day. Number 1, did the rewards of settling in the Canadas outweigh the challenges for immigrants during the early 1800s? And 2, how was life changing for the First Nations? How was it staying the same? So what you're going to do is put the video on pause so that you can write down your responses to these 2 questions. If you don't feel ready to answer either or both of these questions, it means you need to go back and watch this video at least 2 more times. And then when you're confident, put the video on pause. And I look forward to discussing your answers to these 2 questions as well as to the other questions posted throughout this recording. But until tomorrow's class, this concludes today's video.